He tossed her money and told her to handle it alone, but 2 years later, he froze in an airport as a little girl with his blue eyes reached for him. Sophie had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head, imagining every possible reaction, from shock to anger to reluctant acceptance, but nothing prepared her for the cold, mechanical way Gabriel Hansen dismissed her. His office was as immaculate as ever, glass walls that reflected the city skyline, dark marble floors that echoed the slightest step, a desk that seemed to symbolize the distance between them more than any words could. He stood behind it, perfectly composed, his dark hair neatly styled and his blue eyes unreadable, as though she were simply another employee bringing him an inconvenient report instead of the woman carrying his child. She held the pregnancy test in her shaky hands, her breathing uneven, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't how she wanted to tell him. She had loved him once, believed in him, trusted him enough to imagine a future together. But the moment his gaze flicked to the small plastic stick, something inside him shut down entirely. "Here," he said, pulling an envelope from his drawer with the precision of someone signing off on a business transaction. "Take the money. Handle it yourself." For a second the world stopped moving. Sophie stared at the envelope as though it were a bomb about to detonate. She looked up slowly, expecting at least a hint of hesitation or remorse, but all she saw was a man who had already decided this wasn't his problem. He didn't even meet her eyes. He simply extended the envelope across the desk, making it clear the conversation, and his involvement, was over. Her throat tightened until she could barely breathe. "Gabriel," she whispered, unable to stop the tremor in her voice. "This isn't something I can just handle." He sighed as if she were wasting his time. "I don't want complications, Sophie. My life isn't set up for them. You're capable. You'll figure it out." A hollow chill spread through her, deeper and colder than anything she had ever felt. She thought of the nights they had spent together, the soft words he'd spoken, the gentleness he had shown when the world wasn't watching. How many of those moments had been real, and how many had been carefully crafted illusions? She tried to swallow the rising ache in her chest, but her voice still cracked when she spoke again. I thought you cared about me." He finally looked at her, but the warmth she once knew in his blue eyes was gone. He was all steel and calculation now, the man the world praised for his ruthlessness. "I care about my work," he said flatly. "My future. I can't afford distractions." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it, and she turned away, ashamed of her vulnerability in front of a man who no longer deserved it. She wanted to scream, to throw the envelope back at him, to tell him exactly what he was losing. But her strength came in silence. She took the envelope, not because she wanted the money, but because she needed to leave this place and never return. She needed space to breathe, to think, to decide what kind of life she would build now that the one she hoped for had collapsed in front of her. Gabriel didn't follow her. He didn't say her name. He didn't ask her to stay. He simply stood there in his pristine office as she walked out, heels echoing against the cold marble floor, each step peeling away another layer of the life she had imagined. Outside, the city buzzed, unaware of the world falling apart inside her. She clutched the envelope tightly, rage and heartbreak warring within her until she felt hollow. By the time she reached the street, the wind biting at her face, she made a silent promise to herself and to the life growing inside her. She would never give her child the kind of love that could be dismissed so easily. She would raise her baby without relying on someone who could turn cold in a heartbeat. She would protect her future, even if he had refused his. Gabriel returned to his desk and checked his emails, as though nothing monumental had happened. But he didn't know that the next time he saw Sophie Marlowe, everything he believed about his future would be irreversibly shattered by a pair of bright blue eyes that mirrored his own. Sophie moved through the next 2 years as if balancing on a tightrope stretched between survival and love, her entire world reshaped around the tiny life she had sworn to protect. She left the city the very night Gabriel handed her the envelope, unable to bear the thought of raising her baby anywhere near the coldness that had pushed her out. She found a modest apartment near the airport in a smaller town where no one knew her history, and where she could disappear into the steady rhythm of work and motherhood. She found a job at the airport cafe, the kind of place where people came and went in waves, their stories fleeting, their faces forgotten as soon as they left for their flights. The anonymity suited her. It gave her room to breathe and rebuild. It gave her distance from everything she wanted to forget. The pregnancy was lonely and exhausting in ways she had never imagined. She sat through appointments alone. She woke from nightmares alone. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered promises that were meant to soothe the little life growing inside her, but ended up holding her together as well. She refused to think of Gabriel, refused to revisit the moment he told her she was nothing but an inconvenience. Whenever his blue eyes flashed through her memory, she pushed them away. Instead, she focused on saving every dollar, stocking up on diapers and tiny clothes from thrift stores, and learning everything she could about childbirth from late-night articles on her phone. Fear accompanied her constantly, but so did determination. Emma arrived on a quiet winter night, her cry sharp and fierce as if declaring her presence to the world that had no idea how strong she would have to be. Sophie looked at her daughter, the dark hair damp against her tiny head, the startlingly blue eyes blinking up at her, and felt a rush of love so overwhelming that it erased all other emotions. It didn't matter that Sophie was alone. It didn't matter that Emma was a reminder of the man who had walked away. In that moment, holding her daughter for the first time, Sophie understood that she would endure anything to give this child a safe, warm, joyful life. The first year blurred into one long cycle of sleepless nights, feedings, diaper changes, and endless fatigue, but also an endless well of joy. Emma was a curious baby, always reaching for the world, always trying to mimic every sound, every movement. She developed an early fascination with airplanes, perhaps because she spent so much time in the airport while Sophie worked. Pilots would wave at her as they passed, and one gave her a small plastic toy plane that became her constant companion. Sophie would take breaks when she could, carrying Emma outside to watch the takeoffs together. The roar of engines became a familiar lullaby. By the time Emma turned 2, she was bright, energetic, and confidently toddling through the terminal with her toy plane clutched tightly in one hand. She greeted strangers with enthusiastic babbles, waved at flight attendants, and pressed her face against the windows to watch the planes taxi along the runway. She had Gabriel's blue eyes, deep, striking, impossible to overlook. There were days when Sophie struggled not to stare at them too long, because they brought back memories she worked tirelessly to keep buried. But those eyes were Emma's now, and Sophie refused to let anyone's past taint the future she was building for her daughter. Sophie worked long shifts, often opening the cafe at dawn and returning home with just enough energy to collapse beside her daughter. Yet even through exhaustion, she never regretted her choice to leave. Every giggle, every tiny hand tugging hers forward, every sleepy whisper of a mama reminded her that she had made the right decision. She didn't need Gabriel. Emma didn't need him. They were enough for each other. Still, there were moments, brief, uninvited moments, when Sophie wondered if he had changed, if he ever thought about her, if he ever imagined the life he had rejected. She tried to push those thoughts away quickly, reminding herself that he had made his position painfully clear. He didn't want complications. He didn't want responsibility. He didn't want them. But life had a way of circling back, of refusing to let certain truths remain buried forever. Sophie didn't know it yet, but fate was already working quietly behind the scenes, aligning paths that had once diverged. It would take only a single misaligned flight schedule and a crowded terminal to unravel the distance she had worked so hard to build. And when that moment came, Gabriel Hansen would look into the blue eyes of a little girl who held a toy plane, and everything he believed about his future would crumble. The airport terminal was unusually chaotic that afternoon, filled with the restless energy that always accompanied delayed flights. People paced in long loops, dragging luggage behind them, announcements echoed overhead in a calm voice that didn't match the frustration simmering in the air. Children cried, couples argued, and travelers stared anxiously at departure boards that refused to update. Sophie held Emma's small hand as they navigated through the crowd, her other hand balancing a tray of drinks for the cafe. Emma trotted beside her with determined little steps, her toy airplane clutched tightly in her fingers. She wore a pale yellow sweater and white tights, her dark curls bouncing with each movement, her bright blue eyes darting around the terminal with fascination. Even in the chaos, she smiled, pointing at every airplane poster or suitcase that reminded her of flying. For Sophie, moments like this were grounding. They made the sleepless nights and constant rushing feel worthwhile. Emma was her world, her anchor, her reason for pushing forward with a strength she didn't know she had before becoming a mother. As they approached the cafe, Sophie noticed a sudden shift in the crowd near the check-in area, voices rising just enough to draw attention, strangers stepping aside as someone tall moved through the line. She didn't think much of it at first. Airports attracted executives, celebrities, and wealthy clients all the time. But when a familiar voice rose above the chatter, asking for directions in its firm, confident cadence, Sophie stopped so abruptly that Emma bumped into her leg. The sound hit her like a jolt to the chest. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years, yet it lived in her memory with painful clarity, echoing across every sleepless night she once spent alone. Emma tugged on her hand. "Mama?" she asked innocently, unaware of the storm rising inside her mother. Sophie couldn't move. Her breath caught as she turned her head toward the sound, already knowing what she would see but hoping, pleading, that she was wrong. And then she saw him. Gabriel Hansen stood near the check-in counter, tall and immaculately dressed, though his dark hair looked slightly disheveled and there was a tension in his posture she didn't remember. His blue eyes scanned the monitors with impatience, and even from a distance Sophie could see the faint shadows beneath them, evidence of sleepless nights or burdens he once hid behind arrogance. Time had changed him, subtly but unmistakably. She felt the ground sway beneath her. Emma followed her mother's gaze, curiosity brightening her face. The toddler pointed her tiny plane toward Gabriel. "Mama! Look! Airplane man." She meant nothing by it, she pointed out everything airplane-related, but the words were enough to make Gabriel turn his head toward them. His gaze landed on Sophie first. He froze. The color drained from his face, as though seeing her pulled him out of whatever world he'd been living in these past 2 years. Shock widened his eyes, then disbelief, then something deeper, messier, more painful. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Sophie wished she could vanish into the floor. But then his eyes shifted downward, and that was the moment everything changed. He saw Emma. Saw her dark hair, so much like his. Saw her soft blue eyes, the very same shade as his own, staring back at him with innocent curiosity. Saw her tiny hands holding the toy plane. Saw the unmistakable reflection of himself in the face of a child he had never expected to see. His expression shattered. There was no other word for it. The carefully built composure he always carried dissolved in an instant, replaced by raw shock, confusion, fear, and something like recognition hitting him with the force of a blow. Emma blinked up at him, fascinated. She took a small step forward, lifted her toy plane, and wiggled it in greeting. "Hi," she chirped, delighted simply to meet someone new. Gabriel's lips parted, but he still couldn't speak. His hands trembled at his sides. Sophie forced herself to move, stepping protectively in front of Emma. Her heart was racing so hard she could barely hear over it. She hadn't prepared for this moment. She hadn't even imagined it. Not here. Not like this. Not with her daughter standing between them, oblivious to the complicated history crashing over the adults. Gabriel finally managed a single, breathless word. "Sophie." She swallowed hard. "Gabriel." He looked back at Emma again, really looked, and his eyes filled with a devastation she had never seen before. Is she? His voice broke. He tried again. Is she mine? Emma tugged on Sophie's coat, oblivious to the gravity of the question. Mama, look. Plain, she said, showing off her toy with pride. Sophie's heart twisted painfully at the innocence of it all. She met Gabriel's eyes, her voice steady but quiet, holding years of hurt. Yes. The truth hung in the air, heavier than the airport noise around them. Gabriel staggered back half a step as if the force of her answer struck him physically. Shock washed over his features, followed by guilt so deep it hardened into something like grief. His hand lifted slightly, as though reaching for Emma, but he stopped himself before he even got close. He looked like a man watching his world tilt off its axis, unable to find something solid to hold on to. I didn't know, he whispered. You didn't want to know, Sophie replied, not unkindly but truthfully. Gabriel flinched again. Emma, completely unaware of the emotional earthquake happening around her, toddled behind Sophie's legs, peeking at Gabriel shyly. Her presence alone seemed to break him further, every blink, every tilt of her head, every tiny movement reminding him of the years he had missed, the choices he couldn't undo. People moved around them in the terminal, but it felt as if the three of them were frozen in a bubble no one else could penetrate. Sophie finally took a breath. This isn't the place, she said softly. Not here. Gabriel nodded numbly, his eyes never leaving Emma. He looked lost, terrified, and heartbreakingly human. Sophie tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, preparing to lead her away. But before she could take a step, Emma looked up at Gabriel one last time and lifted her arms toward him in a gesture of pure trust. He didn't move. He couldn't. He looked at Sophie again, silently begging for something he hadn't yet earned. And Sophie realized, with a sinking weight in her chest, that this moment, this accidental collision of past and future, was only the beginning. Sophie led Emma away from the crowded check-in area toward a quieter corner of the terminal, her pulse still pounding in her ears as if she were trying to outrun something that had already caught up to her. She had never felt so exposed, so unprepared, so torn between past wounds and present shock. Emma toddled alongside her, glancing back repeatedly at the man who had stared at her with such intensity. Sophie could feel the tremor in her own hands, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, to keep her emotions contained. The last thing Emma needed was to sense her mother unraveling. When Sophie finally reached a quieter seating area near the large floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway, she turned, and Gabriel was already there. He had followed them at a distance, careful not to overwhelm, but determined not to lose sight of them again. He approached slowly now, as though every step felt dangerous. When he stopped a few feet away, he looked at Sophie, not with arrogance or entitlement, but with a fear so palpable she felt it like a physical presence in the air between them. Please don't walk away, he said quietly, his voice strained. Not yet. Sophie swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to scream, to push him back into the world he came from, to make him feel even a fraction of the abandonment she carried inside. Another part, the tired, vulnerable part, knew that turning her back now wouldn't erase the past. Emma existed. Emma was here. And no matter how painful it was, the man standing in front of her was part of the reason she existed at all. Sophie motioned to the empty seats. Gabriel sat down carefully, leaving noticeable space between them, but his eyes drifted constantly to Emma, who was busy pressing her hands against the window to watch a plane taxiing down the runway. Sophie could see the emotions tearing through him, shock, regret, disbelief, clashing all at once and leaving him visibly unsteady. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Sophie. I didn't know. I had no idea. He ran a hand through his dark hair, shoulders slumping. If I had known. She cut him off gently but firmly. You didn't want to know. That's the part you keep forgetting. He recoiled as if struck. I was stupid. I was selfish. His words faltered as he glanced at Emma again. I never imagined she existed. Or that she could. His breath hitched. She looks like me. Sophie's throat tightened. Yes. She does. He stared at the little girl in her soft yellow sweater, mesmerized by her blue eyes, his eyes, reflecting the skyline outside the window. She traced the glass with her tiny fingers and mumbled something about the big airplane, completely unaware of how profoundly her existence was shaking the man behind her. Gabriel's composure fractured visibly. He clenched his jaw, his eyes glistening with something dangerously close to tears. I've missed everything, he whispered. Her first steps. Her first words. Her first, everything. Sophie's chest ached at the truth in his voice, but she kept her tone steady. Yes. You did. He closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of those words. When he looked back at Sophie, his expression was raw. I can't change what I said to you. I wish I could rip those words out of my memory. Out of yours. I thought I was protecting myself, my career, my stability. But all I did was destroy something I didn't even understand. Sophie looked away, her gaze settling on Emma's reflection in the window. She remembered the day Gabriel pushed her out of his life. She remembered crying alone in a bare apartment, wondering how she would survive, how she would raise a child without a single ounce of support from the man who helped create her. She remembered feeling terrified, angry, betrayed. And yet, here she was, stronger, steadier, and no longer the woman he dismissed so easily. She turned back to him. Gabriel, you didn't just hurt me. You abandoned her before she even took her first breath. And now you're standing here acting shocked that life went on without you. He lowered his head, shame washing over him. I deserve that, he said softly. Every part of it. Emma suddenly turned and toddled toward them, clutching her toy plane. She climbed into Sophie's lap, leaning her small body against her as she examined Gabriel curiously. Gabriel smiled weakly, unsure of how close he was allowed to be. Emma tilted her head, studying him with the innocent scrutiny only a child could possess. Then she reached out and touched his sleeve lightly, fascinated by the texture of his jacket. The contact made Gabriel inhale sharply, as though her tiny fingers had pierced straight through his ribs. She likes airplanes, Sophie said quietly, feeling strangely compelled to offer something that wasn't sharp or defensive. She watches them with me during my breaks. Gabriel nodded, his gaze softening. She looks happy. She is, Sophie replied. I've tried very hard to give her a good life. And you have, he said with conviction that startled her. You've given her more than I ever could have. Sophie blinked, taken aback. Gabriel. No, he interrupted gently. You did everything. You were mother and father. You were the one who stayed. Emma shifted in Sophie's lap, then reached toward Gabriel again, showing him her toy plane as if offering him a small piece of her world. He hesitated only a moment before carefully taking the tiny toy in his fingers and examining it with reverence, as though it were something sacred instead of cheap plastic. When he placed it back in her hands, his voice cracked. It's perfect, he whispered. She's perfect. Sophie's heart twisted unexpectedly. The man who once told her to handle everything alone now looked like he was falling apart from the realization of what he had lost. She took a shaky breath. I don't know what you expect now. Gabriel met her gaze, and for the first time in all the years she had known him, there was no arrogance, no pride, no armor. Just truth. I don't expect anything. I don't deserve expectations. But I want to try. I want to know her. I want to understand her. I want to be part of her life, even if it takes time and even if you never forgive me." Sophie didn't respond right away. The wound was old, but it wasn't fully healed. Part of her wanted to push him away forever. Another part, the part that saw Gabriel gently return a toy plane to a curious little girl, wondered what it might mean to stop running from the past. Emma giggled suddenly, pressing the toy against Gabriel's knee as a playful nudge. Gabriel laughed softly, the sound tremulous and disbelieving. Sophie watched them, her chest tightening around emotions she had spent years refusing to feel. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't resolution. But it was the first fragile moment where the future didn't look impossible. And for now, that would have to be enough. Gabriel showed up at the airport the next day, although Sophie had not agreed to anything, had not encouraged him, had not even promised she would speak to him again. She had simply gathered Emma in her arms and walked away after their conversation, leaving him standing in the terminal torn open in a way she never thought possible. Yet when she arrived for her morning shift, pushing Emma in her small stroller with a snack cup balanced in her hand, she saw him sitting on one of the benches near the cafe, his elbows resting on his knees as if he had been waiting for hours. He stood quickly when he spotted them, his expression hopeful yet hesitant, like a man terrified of scaring away the only thing he now wanted more than anything. Sophie stopped several steps away, unsure of what to feel. Emma, however, had no such hesitation. She squealed in recognition, wriggling excitedly in her stroller and pointing both chubby hands toward him as if he were a familiar character from her favorite book rather than the man who had once refused her existence. Sophie's heart twisted as Emma's bright laughter echoed through the terminal. Gabriel approached slowly, mindful of Sophie's caution, and kneeled beside the stroller. He didn't touch Emma until she reached for him first, tugging at his sleeve with delighted insistence. He let her grab hold of his fingers, marveling at how small they were compared to his. The awe in his expression was unfiltered, unhidden, so profound that Sophie found herself unable to look away. She had never seen him like this, softened, unguarded, stripped of every layer of arrogance he once wore like armor. She had seen him powerful, confident, efficient, commanding. But this? This quiet disbelief, this trembling joy, this was new. And dangerous. When her break came, Sophie reluctantly allowed him to join them at the small table near the window. Emma munched on her crackers while Gabriel attempted to coax words out of her, mimicking her toddler speech with an earnestness that made Sophie's chest tighten. He learned quickly that Emma responded best to gentle humor, that she loved being asked about the planes, and that she would babble endlessly if someone showed genuine interest. Despite herself, Sophie found her gaze drifting toward him more often than she wanted. There was a sincerity in him she didn't trust yet, but could no longer deny. He didn't try to talk to Sophie about the past that first day, and she appreciated it more than he knew. He focused entirely on Emma, letting his actions speak in a way his words had once failed to. But on the third day, when Emma toddled off to play with a stack of abandoned luggage carts in plain sight, he finally leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Sophie could hear him. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes at first. He seemed to be choosing his words with the care of someone handling fragile glass. 2 years ago, when you told me, when you said you were pregnant, I panicked. Not because I didn't want you or the baby, but because I had spent my entire life being told that love was a weakness and that family would destroy everything I had worked for. My father drilled that into me until I believed it without question. I thought if I let anyone get too close, it would all fall apart. The company, my goals, my future. Sophie stiffened slightly. And what about my future? He flinched, guilt flickering across his features. I didn't think about yours. Or hers. I didn't think like a man who loved someone. I thought like someone running from a shadow. Sophie was silent for a long moment. The hurt was still there, still sharp beneath the surface even if time had dulled its edges. "You didn't just run," she finally said. "You threw me out of your life without even looking at me." His blue eyes lifted to hers with raw honesty. "I know. And that's something I will regret for the rest of my life." Emma ran back to them then, her toy airplane raised above her head as she proclaimed loudly that she had fixed it, despite the plane never having been broken. Gabriel laughed, not at her but with her, as she climbed clumsily into his lap without the slightest hesitation. He held her gently, as though every second with her was a privilege he was afraid to ruin. Sophie watched them with conflicted emotions swirling inside her. Seeing Gabriel with Emma was like watching a door she had sealed shut begin to crack open on its own. She wanted to slam it closed again. She wanted to leave it ajar. She wanted to run. She wanted to stay. Every part of her warred with itself. He had abandoned her. He had abandoned Emma. And yet, he was here now. He was trying. And not for show, not for control, not out of obligation, but because something inside him had shifted irrevocably. Later that afternoon, as Sophie packed up her things to go home, Gabriel lingered awkwardly beside her. "Sophie," he said, clearing his throat, "I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I want to be someone she can rely on. Someone who shows up. Someone who doesn't run." His voice softened. "If you let me." She hesitated, clutching Emma's coat in her hands. "It's not just about showing up once or twice," she said quietly. "It's about being consistent. Being stable. Being someone she can trust." "I know," he said. "And I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Sophie didn't respond. She lifted Emma into her arms, pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, and began walking toward the exit. Gabriel followed her with his eyes the entire way, his expression a mixture of fear and hope. And as she stepped into the cool afternoon air, Sophie felt something settle in her chest, a trembling awareness that her life, once so carefully rebuilt, was shifting again whether she wanted it to or not. She wasn't ready to let Gabriel back into her world. But she also wasn't ready to push him out entirely. And that fragile middle ground, that uncertain in-between, felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. Gabriel began to appear in Sophie's life with a regularity that unsettled her, not because it felt intrusive but because it felt strangely natural, as if he had always belonged there, even though she knew he hadn't. Each morning he showed up at the airport terminal with the same nervous determination, dressed in expensive suits on some days and casual sweaters on others, but always carrying the same quiet hope in his eyes. He never assumed anything. He never pushed. He simply existed on the edges of her daily routine, taking whatever moments she was willing to offer and never reaching for more than she allowed. It was an unfamiliar gentleness from a man she once knew as sharp and impenetrable as stone. Emma, however, welcomed him with the boundless acceptance only a child untouched by betrayal could offer. She ran toward him with her arms outstretched, her toy airplane waving wildly in the air as she squealed his name, or rather, her version of it, a muddled Gabriel, that made him smile every time he heard it. He carried her on his shoulders, let her tug on his hair, listened to her ramble about airplanes and clouds and the funny noise the vending machine made when it dropped snacks. Sophie watched cautiously from a distance, waiting for him to falter, to grow irritated, to reveal some crack that would remind her why she left. But he never did. His patience seemed endless, his tenderness unwavering, his fascination with Emma growing deeper with every new day he spent learning the contours of her tiny world. For Sophie, watching him wasn't easy. Some days she felt anger simmer beneath her ribs, triggered by how effortless he made it look now, when she had struggled through sleepless nights and terrified mornings completely alone. Other days the sight of him holding Emma made something warm bloom in her chest, a dangerous warmth she tried to extinguish before it spread. And on rare occasions, when Gabriel looked at her over Emma's head with gratitude so raw it seemed almost fragile, she had to turn away entirely, afraid her own emotions would betray her. She reminded herself often that a man could regret his past and still not be safe to trust. She had no intention of offering forgiveness simply because he finally understood the consequences of his choices. But she couldn't deny the truth, he was trying. Day after day, moment after moment, he showed up. One afternoon, after Sophie's long shift, they took Emma to the small observation deck where travelers often watched planes take off. Emma pressed her face to the glass with wide eyes as a jet roared down the runway, her little hands bouncing excitedly. Sophie leaned against the railing, exhausted but content to let Emma enjoy the display. Gabriel stood beside them, silent for several minutes, watching mother and daughter with an expression Sophie couldn't decipher. The sunlight caught the blue of his eyes, softening him in a way that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "She loves this place," he said finally, his voice low, almost reverent. Sophie nodded. "It's her whole world. She grew up watching planes with me. It became our thing." Gabriel exhaled slowly. "I wish I had been there for that." "You weren't," she replied, not unkindly but firmly, anchoring him in the truth. "I had to make it special for her on my own." He didn't argue. He accepted her words with a quiet nod. "I know. And you did more than I ever could have. I mean that." She studied him, trying to determine whether he was simply saying what he thought she wanted to hear. But there was no falseness in his voice, no smoothness, no strategic phrasing. It was just honesty. She wasn't sure how to handle that. Emma turned then, toddling toward Gabriel with her arms up. He lifted her instinctively, holding her close as she rested her head on his shoulder with complete trust. Sophie felt something twist inside her at the sight. Emma barely ever rested like that with strangers. But with Gabriel, she melted into him as though she recognized something in him she couldn't explain. Gabriel looked at Sophie over Emma's head, his expression stunned, softened, undone. "She feels safe with you," Sophie said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. Gabriel blinked, his voice nearly breaking. "I don't deserve that. But I'm grateful for it." They stood in silence for several seconds, the noise of the airport fading behind the hum of a departing aircraft. Sophie watched Emma play with the collar of Gabriel's shirt, watched him whisper something gentle into her hair, watched the easy way he adjusted her weight as though he had carried her all her life. It terrified her. And it moved her. Both emotions threatened to collide, leaving her unsteady. When Emma wriggled out of his arms and ran toward the window again, Gabriel finally spoke the words Sophie felt brewing in him all afternoon. "Sophie. I know I can't change the past. But I want to be part of her future. Not halfway. Not occasionally. I want to be in her life fully. Whatever it takes." She looked down at her hands, then lifted her gaze to his. "Wanting something is easy, Gabriel. But commitment? Consistency? Showing up even on the hard days? That's something else entirely." He nodded without hesitation. "Then let me prove it." Sophie's breath caught at the quiet conviction in his voice. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't negotiating. He was simply offering himself, imperfect, remorseful, transformed in ways she didn't yet understand. She didn't give him an answer. She couldn't. But she also didn't walk away. And that alone seemed to mean everything to him. Later, as she carried a sleepy Emma toward the exit, she glanced back over her shoulder. Gabriel stood watching them, hands in his pockets, eyes filled with something that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Hope. Fragile, trembling, and impossibly persistent. Sophie didn't know what the future held or whether her heart could withstand letting him into their lives again. But for the first time, she didn't shut the door on the possibility. And Gabriel, watching mother and daughter disappear into the evening light, silently vowed that he would spend every day proving he deserved even a fraction of that hope. Gabriel's quiet persistence continued through the following weeks, not with the entitled confidence of the man Sophie once knew, but with the careful humility of someone who understood that every moment he was given was something he hadn't earned yet. He arrived early and stayed late, timing his presence around Sophie's shifts so that he never disrupted her routine. If she seemed tired, he offered to walk Emma through the terminal to give her a moment to breathe. If Emma grew fussy, he knelt beside her, whispering gentle nonsense until her tears subsided. He didn't try to take control. He didn't push Sophie for decisions or demand more than she offered. Instead, he focused on learning who Emma was, the tiny pieces of her personality he had missed for 2 years, and adjusting himself to her world rather than expecting her to enter his. One late afternoon, when the airport was quieter than usual and the sun cast long golden stripes across the polished floor, Sophie suggested they take Emma outside to the grassy area near the parking structures. It wasn't a park by any means, but it was open space, and Emma loved the feeling of running on real ground instead of tile. Gabriel agreed instantly, though Sophie could see by the way his posture stiffened that he wasn't sure what the outing meant. To her, it meant nothing more than fresh air and space for her daughter. To him, it seemed like an invitation into a part of her life he hadn't touched since she left, and perhaps a part he wasn't certain he was welcome in. Emma ran through the grass with delighted shrieks, waving her toy airplane as she pretended to make it fly. Gabriel followed closely, always a few steps behind her in case she tripped. Sophie watched as he scooped her into his arms when she stumbled, holding her with a gentle steadiness that contradicted everything she remembered about him. The man who once treated vulnerability as a defect had become someone she barely recognized, a man who crouched in the grass without hesitation, who let Emma smear dirt on his sleeves without a single complaint, who listened to every jumbled sentence she spoke as if she were offering him the secrets of the universe. Sophie sat on a bench under a tree, feeling strangely out of place in a scene that should have been impossible. Gabriel eventually joined her, leaving Emma a few feet away to chase a bird she had no hope of catching. He didn't sit too close, but he didn't keep his distance either. The space between them felt intentional, weighted, cautious. For a while neither spoke, both pretending to watch Emma, both acutely aware of the presence beside them. Finally, Gabriel shifted slightly, his voice quiet. "I've been thinking a lot about who I was back then." Sophie stiffened, unsure she wanted to revisit the past, but she didn't interrupt him. "I thought ambition would define me," he continued. "I thought if I made myself untouchable, I'd never repeat my father's mistakes." He was unkind, detached. He treated emotions like nothing more than liabilities. "I grew up believing that caring too much made a man weak." He paused, his gaze fixed on Emma as she toddled across the grass. "So I built my life around that idea. I convinced myself success meant I didn't have room for anything unpredictable. Anything I couldn't control." Sophie exhaled slowly. "And you saw a child as something you couldn't control." "I saw everything wrong," he admitted, voice thick with regret. "And I saw you as the person who could unravel everything I had built. My career. My image. My sense of order. So I pushed you away before you had the chance." She looked at him sharply. "You didn't push me away, Gabriel. You shoved me out of your life without looking back." His throat worked as he swallowed. "I know. And I will never forgive myself for that." Sophie wanted to stay angry. She wanted to hold on to the resentment that had protected her for so long. But hearing him speak with such honesty made her chest ache unexpectedly. The man beside her had cracks she'd never seen before, cracks that revealed softness instead of steel. He rubbed his palms together, a rare sign of nerves. "I'm not asking you to forget the past. I know I don't deserve that. I just want to build a future where Emma knows her father. Where she knows she wasn't unwanted. And maybe, if time allows, or you can look at me without remembering the worst version of who I was." Sophie let the silence stretch between them. She watched Emma tumble into the grass, her laughter ringing into the warm air. She watched Gabriel instinctively lean forward, ready to catch her if she fell too hard. She watched the man he had become, a man changed by absence, regret, and the sudden, overwhelming love he felt for a daughter he had never known. "You're not the same person," she said finally, her voice soft. "I see that. But change isn't enough by itself. It has to last. It has to be real." "It is," he said immediately. "I don't know how to prove it to you yet, but I will." Emma ran back to them then, breathing hard from her adventures. She clambered onto Gabriel's lap without hesitation, curling against him as though she had known him all her life. He held her gently, his eyes shining with a mixture of wonder and heartbreak. Sophie watched them, feeling something inside her shift, something slow, hesitant, and frighteningly hopeful. When Emma lifted her toy airplane toward Gabriel and said, "Fly with me," he smiled with a warmth that reached every corner of his expression. "I'll fly with you anywhere," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her dark curls. Sophie's breath caught in her throat at the sight. It was in that moment, more than any apology or promise, that she understood how deeply he had changed. And it terrified her how much she wanted to believe him. Summer settled fully over the town, bringing with it long, warm evenings and a gentler rhythm that made everything feel softer than the months before. The airport no longer felt like a place of constant rushing. In the evenings, sunlight poured through the high windows like molten gold, making the entire terminal glow. Sophie had grown used to seeing Gabriel in this light, arriving each day with a quiet steadiness that no longer surprised her. What surprised her instead was how natural it felt to have him there, not as a shadow of her past, not as a threat to her peace, but as someone slowly stitching himself into the edges of her life. Emma adored him now, and that bond had grown deeper with every shared laugh, every small moment of trust. She ran to him with unfiltered joy, and he lifted her with a tenderness Sophie could never have imagined from the man who once refused to even look at her. That transformation alone still unsettled Sophie, but it also warmed something inside her that had been locked away for far too long. One weekend, the airport hosted a small community event, a summer fair with food stands, music, and a corner set aside for children's games. Families gathered around, travelers lingered to enjoy the festivities, and laughter spilled across the usually sterile terminals. Sophie arrived with Emma in her arms, expecting a simple afternoon for her daughter. What she didn't expect was the way her breath caught when she saw Gabriel waiting for them near a balloon arch, holding a tiny blue balloon shaped like an airplane. He looked almost nervous, as if unsure whether bringing the balloon was too much or not enough. Emma squealed, reaching for him, and Gabriel's entire face lit up as he handed her the balloon. Sophie felt her chest tighten with something she didn't want to name. They walked together through the fair, letting Emma try everything her small hands could reach. She painted messy streaks across a paper airplane cutout, won a plastic bracelet at a ring toss, and clung to Gabriel's shoulders as he carried her through crowds. Every time she laughed, Gabriel looked like it was the first time he'd heard the sound. His joy was real, so real that Sophie found herself watching him more than she intended. As the sun began to set outside, lanterns flickered on throughout the terminal, casting warm circles of light. The music softened, and families settled in near the windows to watch the final activity of the evening, the outdoor light show visible through the terminal's giant glass walls. Sophie and Gabriel found a quieter spot near one of the pillars, spreading out a blanket that Sophie always kept in Emma's backpack. Emma plopped down between them, her balloon floating lazily above her, her tiny hand gripping Gabriel's fingers. A comfortable silence settled over them. They watched the colors shift outside as the first lights danced across the summer sky. Sophie felt the weight of the day slowly melt from her shoulders, leaving behind a strange calm she hadn't known in years. She glanced at Gabriel, noticing the way he was watching Emma with that same wonder he carried every day. He held her hand as if it were the most important thing he had ever touched. When Emma finally grew tired, she climbed onto Sophie's lap, letting her head rest on her mother's chest. A few minutes later, she reached her small hand toward Gabriel again, sleepy but insistent. He shifted closer, letting her rest her other hand on his knee, a gesture that seemed to complete a circle Sophie had never expected to form. Gabriel glanced at Sophie, and the softness in his eyes made her heart tremble. The lanterns above them reflected in his blue irises, turning them into shimmering pools that held 1,000 unspoken things. He cleared his throat gently, as if steadying himself before stepping off a cliff. "Sophie," he began quietly, "I've been trying to find the right moment to say this. But I think if I wait for perfect timing, I'll lose the chance." He paused, looking down at Emma's small hand resting against his. "I never understood what it meant to love someone until now. I thought love was a weakness. I thought family would break me. But the truth is, living without it, living without her, broke something much deeper." Sophie held her breath, unsure whether she wanted him to continue or stop before he shattered the fragile balance they had managed to create. He looked up again, meeting her gaze directly. "I love her, Sophie. I love her more than anything I've ever known. And His voice softened into something almost fragile. "I never stopped loving you. Even when I denied it. Even when I was too afraid to face what I felt." The words landed quietly, without the dramatic weight he might have once used. They weren't spoken to impress her or sway her. They were simply true. Sophie felt a rush of emotions, all tangled and overwhelming. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't prepared to let those words in. Part of her still ached from the wound he left. Part of her wanted to believe him. And part of her, the part she had hidden away, wanted to let herself feel something other than pain again. "Gabriel," she said softly, "you hurt me. Deeply. You hurt her without even knowing it. I can't pretend that didn't happen." His expression faltered, but he nodded. "I know. And I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking for the chance to build something different. Something better. For her. For you. For me." She stared at him for a long moment, the lanterns flickering above them like breaths of hope. Emma shifted in her sleep, her tiny body warm and trusting against Sophie's. Sophie looked at her daughter's peaceful face, then at the man who was finally trying to become the father, and perhaps the partner, he should have been all along. "I can't give you an answer today," Sophie whispered. "But I'm not closing the door." Gabriel exhaled slowly, relief spreading through him like warmth. "That's enough," he murmured. "More than enough." For the rest of the evening they sat together in silence, watching the lights dance beyond the glass. Emma slept between them, her small hands touching them both, unknowingly bridging the space that had once felt impossibly wide. And for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to imagine a future where the past didn't define their story. A future where forgiveness and love weren't impossible. A future where second chances could actually heal.